Barren millionaire unexpectedly discovers that the woman who saved him gave him twins. The rain was pounding New York that October night, turning the streets into liquid mirrors that reflected the city lights. Mark Santoro stood at his 47th floor office window, watching his reflection mingle with the raindrops streaming down the glass. At 35, he had built an empire in the financial market, but success had its price. Loneliness was his only constant companion. "Mr. Santoro, your last meeting has been cancelled due to the storm." Rebecca, his executive assistant, announced over the intercom. "Would you like me to call your driver?" "That won't be necessary," he replied, adjusting his Italian tie. Something felt different tonight, a restlessness he couldn't shake. The emptiness of his corner office seemed to mock him, the walls lined with awards and achievements suddenly feeling hollow. The black Mercedes cut through the storm gracefully as Mark navigated the wet streets. His mind wandered to the board meeting earlier that day. Another successful quarter, another round of applause, another evening alone. That's when it happened. A truck lost control on the wet road, skidding towards him. Mark turned the steering wheel sharply, but the car spun, crashing through the guardrail. The world spun in slow motion. Glass shattered, metal twisted. His last conscious thought was of how he had wasted his life chasing zeros in a bank account. "Sir, can you hear me?" The voice was soft, almost musical. Mark struggled to open his eyes, tasting blood in his mouth. A young woman was leaning over him, her brown eyes conveying genuine concern, something he hadn't seen directed at him in years. "The paramedics are on their way," she said, taking his hand firmly. "Stay with me, please. What's your name?" "Mark," he whispered, surprised at how difficult it was to speak. "Mark Santoro." "Nice to meet you, Mark. I'm Sophia." The rain was still falling, but she shielded him with her own coat, ignoring that she was getting drenched. There was something in her eyes, a depth, a story untold. Why, he managed to ask, "Why are you helping me?" She smiled, a smile that would haunt his dreams for years to come. "Because every life matters," she replied simply, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. But there was something else in her expression, a flicker of recognition perhaps, or fear. He couldn't tell through the haze of pain. As consciousness slipped away, Mark caught fragments of a phone conversation. Sophia's voice had changed, becoming tense, worried. "Yes, I understand. No, you don't need to. I'll handle it." The words faded into darkness, leaving questions that would take years to answer. Later he would learn that she stayed until the paramedics arrived, then disappeared into the night, leaving only a note with a phone number. But that moment in the rain marked the beginning of a story that would challenge everything he believed about success, love, and the price of truth. What Mark Santoro didn't know, as he lay in that twisted wreck, was that this accident wasn't just a random event. It was the first domino in a chain that would unravel decades of secrets, expose a web of betrayal, and force him to choose between the empire he'd built and a chance at real happiness. And Sophia? She walked away from the accident scene, her hands shaking as she made another call. "It's done," she whispered into the phone. "He's alive. Yes, I know what's at stake. I know exactly who he is." The Santoro Enterprises headquarters dominated Manhattan's skyline, a glass and steel monument to success that seemed to touch the clouds. Inside his penthouse office on the 47th floor, Mark Santoro's empire spread out before him like a carefully constructed chessboard. Yet, 3 weeks after the accident, something had shifted in his perfectly ordered world. "The quarterly reports are ready for your review, and the board expects confirmation on the Shanghai merger," Rebecca announced, her heels clicking efficiently across the marble floor. She paused, studying her boss with barely concealed concern. In 15 years, she had never seen him so distracted. Mark touched the scar on his temple, a souvenir from the crash, and stared at the untouched stack of contracts on his desk. The numbers that once consumed his every waking moment now seemed to blur together, meaningless digits that couldn't fill the void he'd become acutely aware of since that rainy night. His phone buzzed another message from his mother, reminding him about the charity gala where she'd conveniently invited Catherine Maxwell, the daughter of a shipping magnate. The perfect match on paper, his mother had insisted. Mark deleted the message without responding. The truth was, Mark Santoro had everything society deemed valuable: a penthouse overlooking Central Park, a fleet of luxury cars, vacation homes in 5 countries, and a net worth that made him a regular on Forbes lists. Yet his vast apartment felt more like a museum than a home, filled with expensive art pieces that no one but his housekeeper ever noticed. His private elevator opened directly into his office, where he spent most of his waking hours. The wall of awards and accolades seemed to mock him now: 40 under 40 under 40 Financial Innovator of the Year, New York's Most Eligible Bachelor. Each title a brick in the wall he'd built around himself. Mr. Santoro, Rebecca's voice interrupted his thoughts. "Mr. Blake is here to see you." Victor Blake entered without waiting for a response, his expensive suit and predatory smile a reflection of the world Mark had thrived in for so long. As the company's lead counsel, Victor had been instrumental in building Santoro Enterprises' legal fortress. "Mark, you've been distracted," Victor began, settling into a leather chair without invitation. "The board is starting to notice. This accident seems to have affected you more than it should." Mark's hand instinctively went to his pocket, where he kept the note Sophia had left at the hospital. He hadn't called the number yet, though he'd memorized every digit. "I'm fine," Victor Mark replied, but his voice lacked conviction. The truth was, he couldn't shake the memory of those brown eyes, of genuine concern in a world where every interaction was usually calculated for maximum benefit. His gaze drifted to the photographs on his desk: corporate events, business achievements, handshakes with politicians and industry leaders. Not a single personal moment among them. No family, no real friends, just strategic alliances and business partnerships. "The Preston merger won't wait forever," Victor pressed, his eyes sharp. "And there are rumors about changes you're considering. Changes that might not align with the company's interests." The threat was subtle but clear. Mark had built his empire on aggressive expansion and ruthless efficiency. Any sign of weakness or deviation from that path would be seen as a liability. Yet for the first time in his career, Mark Santoro found himself wondering if the price of success might be higher than he was willing to pay. 40 blocks and a world away from Santoro Enterprises, Sophia Matthews knelt in the dirt of PS 721's community garden, showing a group of eager third-graders how to plant tomato seedlings. Her faded jeans and school logo t-shirt were smudged with soil, but her smile radiated genuine joy. Miss Matthews, look Lucy, a small girl with unruly braids, held up a worm with pride. "Can we keep him in the garden?" "I named him Wiggy." "That's perfect," Lucy Sophia laughed, tucking a stray strand of hair behind her ear. "Wiggy will help make our soil healthy." The children gathered around, their excitement over a simple earthworm revealing the magic Sophia saw in everyday moments. The garden had been her project for the past 2 years, a patch of life and color in the concrete jungle of the Bronx. What started as a few planters had grown into a thriving space where children learned about nature, responsibility, and hope. It wasn't much compared to the gleaming towers of Manhattan, but it was real. Miss Matthews Annie, the elderly owner of the corner bookstore, peered at the garden gate. "Your mail was delivered to my shop again." She held out several envelopes, her kind eyes holding a hint of worry. They both knew what those letters probably contained: more bills, more reminders of the financial tightrope Sophia walked. After the children left, Sophia sat on a wooden bench, finally opening the letters. Medical bills, student loan payments, and a notice of rent increase stared back at her. Her hands trembled slightly as she calculated numbers in her head, wondering how to stretch her teacher's salary even thinner. Her phone buzzed a text from Dr. Martinez's office reminding her about tomorrow's appointment. Sophia quickly deleted it, her heart racing. She couldn't think about that now, couldn't face what those test results might mean. The evening light cast long shadows across the garden as Sophia gathered her things. Through the chain-link fence she could see the Manhattan skyline, including the distinctive silhouette of Santoro Enterprises. Her mind wandered to that rainy night, to Mark Santoro's vulnerable moments before the ambulance arrived. She hadn't told anyone about the accident, about how she'd recognized him immediately from the newspaper photos. How could she explain that the man she'd helped was the same tycoon whose company had indirectly caused so much hardship in her community through aggressive real estate development? Walking home, Sophia passed familiar faces, Mrs. Rodriguez from the laundromat, who sometimes gave her day-old bread, Mr. Chen from the corner store, who let her run a tab when money was tight, the local kids playing basketball in the fading light. This was her world, not perfect, but bound together by genuine human connections. In her tiny one-bedroom apartment, Sophia finally allowed herself to look at the business card she'd been carrying for weeks. The elegant script read Mark Santoro, CEO. She'd kept his number 2, though she knew she should have thrown it away. Some lines weren't meant to be crossed. Some worlds weren't meant to collide. A siren wailed in the distance as Sophia prepared a simple dinner, trying to ignore the mounting pressure of secrets and decisions that weighed on her shoulders. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but for now she found solace in the memory of small hands planting seeds of hope in well-worn soil. The first time Mark visited PS 721, he felt ridiculously out of place in his $3,000 suit. He found Sophia in the garden, surrounded by children who regarded him with a mixture of awe and suspicion. "Class," she announced with a smile that made his heart skip, "this is my friend Mark. He's going to help us today." Before he could protest, Mark found himself kneeling in the dirt, his Italian leather shoes forgotten as Lucy solemnly taught him the difference between tomato and pepper seedlings. "Mr. Mark," she asked with childhood directness, "why are you wearing a prince's outfit to garden?" Sophia's laughter at his predicament was worth every ruined stitch. Over the next few weeks, their worlds began to intertwine in unexpected ways. Mark found himself making excuses to visit the garden, each time staying longer, learning more about a world where success was measured in smiles rather than stock prices. "You're different with them," Sophia observed one evening as they walked through the neighborhood. Mark had just spent an hour reading stories to the after-school group, complete with different voices for each character. More real. "Maybe I'm just different with you," he replied, then caught himself surprised by his own honesty. They stopped at Annie's bookstore, where the old woman watched them with knowing eyes as they browsed dusty shelves, their hands occasionally brushing, each touch sending electricity through them both. But there were moments when Sophia would pull back, a shadow crossing her face. Sometimes Mark caught her checking her phone anxiously, or having hushed conversations that ended abruptly when he approached. Each time he asked, she deflected with practiced ease, changing the subject to the garden's needs or the children's progress. The contrast between their worlds became starker with each meeting. Mark's business dinners at exclusive restaurants felt hollow compared to sharing a simple pizza in Sophia's tiny apartment. Board meetings couldn't match the excitement of helping a child read their first word. Something was shifting in him, a transformation that didn't go unnoticed. "The board is concerned about your recent behavior," Victor Blake warned during one meeting. "These frequent visits to the Bronx, the rumors about social programs, it's not the Santoro Enterprises way." But Mark was beginning to question what exactly the Santoro Enterprises way had cost him. Each evening spent in his empty penthouse felt like punishment after experiencing the warmth of Sophia's world. The walls he'd built around himself were crumbling, and for the first time in his adult life he welcomed the destruction. One evening, as they sat on Sophia's fire escape watching the sunset paint the city gold, she asked the question that had been hanging between them. "What are we doing, Mark? Our worlds are so different." He turned to her, finally brave enough to voice what he'd known since that rainy night. Maybe they don't have to be. Maybe we can build something new, something better. The hope in her eyes warred with fear, and she touched his face gently. Some bridges come with a price, she whispered, and though he didn't understand the full meaning of her words then, they would haunt him in the months to come. The first phone call came early on a Tuesday morning. Sophia was preparing her classroom when her phone vibrated, displaying a number she hadn't seen in years. Her hands trembled as she answered, moving away from the curious ears of early arriving students. "I told you never to contact me here," she whispered, her voice tight with tension. "Yes, I understand." "No, he doesn't suspect anything." Her eyes darted to the door as footsteps approached, but it was just the janitor passing by. These calls became more frequent as her relationship with Mark deepened. They always left her shaken, pale, and distracted during lessons. Annie, who had become something of a surrogate mother figure, noticed the change in her young friend. "Someone's troubling you," dear Annie commented one afternoon as Sophia sought refuge in the bookstore's quiet back room. "I've seen that look before. It's the same one my daughter had when she was carrying secrets too heavy for one person." Sophia managed a weak smile, but her hands clutched her cup of tea too tightly. "It's nothing, Annie. Just some old business I need to handle." But her eyes kept straying to the window, watching for faces in the crowd that didn't belong in their neighborhood. The medical appointments were harder to hide. Dr. Martinez's office was deliberately chosen far from both the Bronx and Manhattan's financial district. Yet even there, Sophia felt exposed, constantly checking over her shoulder in the waiting room. "Your blood pressure is elevated," Dr. Martinez noted during one visit, concern evident in her voice, "and these stress levels aren't good for your condition. Is there someone you can talk to? The father, perhaps?" Sophia shook her head quickly. "He can't know. Not yet. Maybe not ever." She gathered her things, avoiding the doctor's sympathetic gaze. Another appointment card was added to her collection, another secret to keep. The worst call came on a day when Mark had surprised her at the garden. He had arrived unannounced, bringing coffee and pastries for her students, his genuine interest in their lives showing in every interaction. Watching him help Lucy with her reading, Sophia's heart had ached with possibilities. Then her phone buzzed. The number was blocked this time. "Time is running out," the voice said without preamble. "You need to make a decision, or we'll make it for you. Remember what's at stake." "I need more time," Sophia pleaded, moving behind the storage shed. "He's not who I thought he would be. He's different." "That's exactly the problem," the voice cut in. "He's changing, and certain parties are getting nervous. You have 48 hours. When she returned to the garden, Mark was teaching the children a silly song about vegetables. He looked up, his smile fading as he saw her expression. "Everything okay?" he asked, reaching for her hand. Sophia forced a smile but stepped back slightly. "Just school administration stuff," she lied, hating herself for each false word. "Nothing important." That night, alone in her apartment, Sophia pulled out a worn manila envelope from beneath her mattress. Inside were newspaper clippings about Santoro Enterprises, documents with official seals, and a series of surveillance shots of Mark at various points in his life. But it was the last photo that always made her pause, a much younger Catherine Wells, standing next to a small girl with familiar brown eyes. Sophia's phone buzzed again. This time it was a text: "Meeting tomorrow." Usual place. No excuses. It was signed simply V. She pressed her hand against her still flat stomach, where the first signs of life were just beginning to make themselves known. "I'm sorry," she whispered, though whether to Mark, to their unborn child, or to herself, she wasn't sure. Catherine Wells sat in her elegant Upper East Side apartment, staring at the photograph she'd kept hidden in her desk for 28 years. The image showed a younger version of herself holding a newborn baby, a moment of joy before everything fell apart. Her hands trembled as she poured another glass of wine, the evening light casting long shadows across Persian rugs worth more than most people's yearly salary. The phone on her desk rang. "Ms. Wells, Victor Blake is here to see you," her housekeeper announced. Catherine quickly returned the photograph to its hiding place, straightening her designer suit as Victor entered with his characteristic predatory grace. "You're looking well, Catherine," he said, declining the offered drink. "Though I hear you've been making inquiries about certain past events. Events we agreed would stay buried." Catherine met his gaze steadily, decades of boardroom battles evident in her steel spine. "She's my daughter, Victor, my flesh and blood, and now that she's involved with Mark Santoro—" "A coincidence I'm sure you had nothing to do with," Victor interrupted smoothly. "Just as I'm sure you haven't been sending anonymous payments to a certain Bronx School scholarship fund." 28 years ago, Catherine had been a rising star at Santoro Enterprises when a brief affair with a married board member resulted in pregnancy. Victor, then a junior lawyer, had orchestrated everything: the private adoption, the forged documents, the carefully constructed story of a European sabbatical to explain her absence. "I gave up my child to protect your career," Victor reminded her, "to protect the company. And now you want to risk everything because of, what? Maternal guilt." Catherine stood, moving to the window that overlooked Central Park. "She deserves to know the truth. About her father, about me, about why." "The truth," Victor laughed coldly. "The truth is that you chose your career over your child. The truth is that the respected Catherine Wells, vice president of Santoro Enterprises, built her empire on a foundation of secrets. How do you think the board would react to that particular truth?" But Catherine wasn't listening. Her attention was fixed on a medical report lying partially concealed beneath Victor's briefcase: preliminary blood work, genetic testing, pregnancy hormone levels. Her heart stopped as she saw the patient's name: Sophia Matthews. "She's pregnant," Catherine whispered, the pieces falling into place. "That's why you're here. Mark Santoro's child." "Your grandchild," Victor confirmed, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "Quite a family reunion you could have, if of course certain parties don't decide that this situation poses too much risk to the company." Catherine's hand gripped her wine glass so tightly it nearly shattered. "If you hurt her—" "My dear Catherine, I never hurt anyone. I simply manage situations. As I did for you all those years ago." He stood, straightening his tie. "Stay out of this. Consider it the last gift you can give your daughter." After Victor left, Catherine retrieved the photograph again. The baby in the image seemed to stare back at her accusingly. She thought of Sophia, alone and scared, facing the same impossible choice she had made nearly 3 decades ago. Her fingers hovered over her phone. One call could change everything, could reveal the truth, could tear apart the carefully constructed lies that had protected them all for so long. But whose truth would it be? And at what cost? Victor Blake's corner office at Santoro Enterprises offered a direct view of Mark's workspace. From his vantage point, he watched the CEO's increasingly frequent absences with calculated interest. The wall of his private office held photographs spanning decades, subtle reminders of the secrets he'd collected, the lives he'd shaped. Richard Victor called to his older brother, Santoro Enterprises CFO. "Come look at these quarterly projections." He spread documents across his mahogany desk, carefully selected reports showing potential losses if the company shifted towards social responsibility initiatives. Richard Blake studied the numbers, his brow furrowing. "Mark's proposed changes could destabilize everything we've built," he said, unknowingly playing into his brother's narrative. "The shareholders won't stand for it." "Indeed," Victor agreed, sliding another document forward. "And then there's the matter of his frequent visits to a certain school in the Bronx, a school that recently received anonymous donations through rather interesting channels." Victor had orchestrated every detail meticulously. The surveillance photos of Mark and Sophia, the carefully leaked rumors to board members, the strategic placement of concerns about the company's direction. Each move was calculated to create a web of doubt and suspicion. His next target was Sophia herself, The meeting took place in a small cafe far from both their usual haunts. She arrived looking nervous, clutching her bag like a shield. Miss Matthews Victor greeted her with practiced warmth. "Thank you for meeting me. I'm here as a friend, concerned about both you and Mark." He placed a thick folder between them. "There are things you need to know before this goes any further." The folder contained carefully selected information. Past relationships Mark had ended for business advantage, development projects that had displaced entire communities, the ruthless strategies that had built his empire. Each piece was true, but presented without context, painted to create the darkest possible picture. "He's changing," Sophia argued, but her voice held uncertainty. "The foundation, the community programs. Changes that are making him enemies," Victor countered smoothly. "Powerful people who might start asking questions. About you, about your past, about certain medical appointments." He watched the color drain from her face. "Your pregnancy, for instance." Sophia's hand instinctively went to her stomach. "How did you?" "I make it my business to know things, Miss Matthews, just as I know about Catherine Wells and the rather substantial deposits into your school scholarship fund." He leaned forward. "Mark's enemies would love to prove he's being manipulated by a gold digger with a conveniently timed pregnancy." "That's not true," Sophia whispered, but tears were forming in her eyes. "Truth is irrelevant. Perception is everything. Mark's reputation, his company, everything he's built, it could all crumble. Unless he let the word hang between them." "Unless what?" "Unless someone who cares about him makes the right choice. For his sake, and for the sake of the child." Victor placed a plain ticket on the table. "Sometimes love means protecting people from themselves." As Sophia left the cafe, Victor made 2 calls. The first to Catherine Wells, a subtle reminder of past obligations. The second to his network of informants, instructions to monitor every move Mark and Sophia made. The pieces were in place. Now he just had to wait for human nature, fear, doubt, and the desire to protect loved ones to do the rest. The boardroom of Santoro Enterprises fell silent as Mark unveiled his vision for the company's future. Gone were the aggressive acquisition plans and profit-first strategies. In their place, he presented a blueprint for corporate responsibility that made the older board members shift uncomfortably in their leather chairs. "Gentlemen," Mark began, standing before the floor-to-ceiling windows where Manhattan's skyline served as his backdrop. "For years we've measured success by market share and profit margins. Today I'm proposing we redefine what success means for Santoro Enterprises." The projector displayed images of PS 721's community garden, along with plans for similar projects across the city. Mark's voice grew passionate as he outlined a future where corporate power could be leveraged for community benefit. "Imagine transforming vacant lots into green spaces, abandoned buildings into community centers. We have the resources to make real change." But Victor Blake watched from his corner seat, noting every nervous glance exchanged between board members. But Mark continued undeterred, his transformation from ruthless CEO to advocate for change evident in every word. Back in his office, Mark found himself doing something unprecedented, clearing his evening schedule to attend a school fundraiser in the Bronx. Rebecca, his assistant of 15 years, tried to hide her surprise as she rearranged his calendar. "The Preston merger meeting," she began hesitantly. "Can wait," Mark finished, removing his tie and replacing it with one of softer silk, a small concession to the less formal environment he'd be entering. "Some things are more important." The changes weren't just professional. Mark's penthouse, once a showcase of wealth and status, began to show signs of a life actually lived. Children's art from PS 721 appeared on his refrigerator. Books from Annie's shop found homes on his shelves, their worn spines a sharp contrast to his previously untouched first editions. Even his morning routine shifted. Instead of immediate market updates, he found himself starting days reading letters from the children at PS 721, their innocent perspectives on life offering insights no business school had ever taught him. One morning, Studying his reflection as he prepared for work, Mark barely recognized the man looking back at him. The hard edges had softened, replaced by laugh lines around his eyes, evidence of genuine smiles that had become increasingly common. His phone buzzed with a message from Sophia. The kids are planting sunflowers today. They insist their favorite garden helper should be here. The smile that spread across his face was automatic, genuine. In the elevator down to his car, Richard Blake joined him, holding a stack of concerning financial reports. "Mark, about these new initiatives, the numbers don't support." "Numbers aren't everything," Richard Mark interrupted, surprising them both with his certainty. "Sometimes you have to look beyond the spreadsheets to see real value." The transformation wasn't lost on his mother either. During their weekly dinner, she studied him with a mixture of confusion and concern. "Darling, I heard the most peculiar rumors. Something about you teaching gardening to children in the Bronx." Mark set down his fork, meeting her gaze steadily. "Not rumors, Mother, and those children have taught me more about what matters than Harvard Business School ever did." Later that night, standing in Sophia's tiny kitchen, helping her wash dishes after a simple but joy-filled dinner, Mark realized something profound. For the first time in his adult life, he felt genuinely happy. Not the fleeting satisfaction of closing a deal or acquiring a company, but a deep, peaceful contentment. "What are you thinking about?" Sophia asked, catching his contemplative expression. "About how sometimes you have to lose your way to find yourself," he answered, pulling her close, uncaring about his expensive suit getting wet from her soapy hands. The first test of Mark and Sophia's relationship came at the annual Santoro Enterprises charity gala. Mark had insisted on her attending as his date, despite her reservations about entering his world. The contrast between them couldn't have been starker as they entered the opulent Plaza Hotel ballroom. Sophia wore a simple black dress, elegant but clearly not designer, while the other women dripped in diamonds and couture. She felt the weighted stares, heard the whispered conversations that stopped as she passed. Mark's mother, Eleanor Santoro, didn't bother to hide her disapproval, greeting Sophia with a cold assessment that made her heart sink. "A school teacher, Mark." Really, Eleanor's voice carried just far enough to reach nearby guests. "I suppose this explains your recent philanthropic interest." The way she pronounced philanthropic made it sound like a disease. Mark squared his shoulders, his hand firm on Sophia's back. "Mother, Sophia has taught me more about real value in 3 months than I've learned in 15 years of banking." But even as he defended her, Sophia could feel the tension radiating through his touch. The evening became an exercise in subtle cruelty. Women with perfect plastic smiles asked Sophia about her little hobby of teaching, while their husbands cornered Mark with pointed questions about the company's changing direction. Each interaction felt like a paper cut, small but stinging. During dinner, Sophia overheard a conversation at the next table. "I heard she was at the accident scene. Rather convenient, don't you think? These fortune hunters are getting cleverer." The words burned, more so because they unknowingly touched on her secret. Mark found her on the terrace, where she'd escaped for air. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice tight with anger at how she'd been treated. "This isn't what I wanted for tonight." "It's what your world is," Mark. Sophia replied softly. "Maybe they're right. Maybe we're fooling ourselves thinking this could work." Her hand unconsciously moved to her stomach, a gesture Mark didn't notice, but which carried the weight of her unspoken truth. The following week brought more challenges. Mark's board meeting about the foundation's expansion was leaked to the press, leading to speculation about his relationship with the mysterious Bronx teacher. Paparazzi started appearing outside PS 721, disrupting classes and frightening the children. One particularly difficult morning, Lucy arrived at school in tears because a photographer had scared her. Sophia found Mark in her classroom that afternoon, his face dark with fury as he read the tabloid headlines. "I'll put a stop to this," he promised. "I'll have Victor's legal team." No, Sophia interrupted, surprising them both with her vehemence. "No lawyers, no legal teams. That's not how we solve problems here, she gestured to the classroom where children's artwork covered the walls. This is my world, Mark. Simple maybe, but real. I won't have it turned into another corporate battleground. Later that night, alone in her apartment, Sophia received another text from Victor seeing the challenges yet. This is just the beginning. Think about what I said. She deleted the message, but its shadow remained, along with the growing certainty that she would soon have to make an impossible choice. On a quiet evening in Annie's bookstore, long after closing time, Mark and Sophia sat among the dusty shelves having the conversation they'd both been avoiding. The old brass lamp cast warm shadows across their faces as they confronted the growing tensions in their relationship. "You've been distant lately," Mark observed, his fingers tracing patterns on the worn wooden table. "Ever since the gala, something's changed, and it's not just about the photographers or the society gossip, is it?" Sophia cradled her tea, buying time before responding. "Your world sees me as a liability, Mark. A distraction that's making you lose focus on what matters." Her voice carried a weight that suggested she was repeating someone else's words. "What matters?" Mark leaned forward, his tone intense. 3 months ago I thought I knew. Profit margins, market share, acquisitions. Now he gestured to the handwritten signs on the bookshelf about community reading programs. Now I'm questioning everything I built my life on. Annie moved quietly in the background, pretending to organize books while actually keeping watch over what she'd come to think of as her adopted family. She'd seen enough of life to recognize the shadows of unspoken truths hovering between them. "That's exactly what worries me," Sophia admitted. "You're changing your entire life because of me. The foundation, the community programs, challenging your board. What if it's too much? What if one day you wake up and regret throwing away everything you worked for?" Mark's response was interrupted by Victor Blake's unexpected arrival. He entered the bookstore with the smooth confidence of someone accustomed to commanding any room he entered. "I apologize for the intrusion," Victor said, though his tone suggested otherwise. "But we need to discuss the Preston merger, Mark. The shareholders are growing increasingly concerned about your divided attention." The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Sophia stood abruptly, making excuses about needing to prepare for tomorrow's classes. Mark noticed how she avoided looking at Victor, how her hands trembled slightly as she gathered her things. "Stay," Mark requested, reaching for her hand. "Whatever affects the company affects us both now." Victor's laugh held no humor. "Does it? Tell me, Miss Matthews, what exactly do you know about running a multi-billion-dollar corporation? About the responsibilities Mark has to his shareholders, his employees?" "That's enough," Victor Mark warned, but Sophia raised her hand to stop him. "No, he's right to ask," she said quietly. "I don't know anything about running corporations, but I do know about responsibility, about the impact our choices have on others. The children I teach, many of their families were displaced by corporate developments, just like the Preston merger. The confrontation crystallized the fundamental conflict between their worlds. Victor represented everything Mark had been: ruthless efficiency, profit above all. Sophia embodied what he wanted to become: compassion, community, real human connection. "You can't have both worlds," Mark Victor stated coldly. "Sooner or later, you'll have to choose." After Victor left, the silence between Mark and Sophia felt heavy with unspoken fears. Finally, Mark broke it. "He's wrong. We can build something new, something better, together." Sophia touched his face gently, memorizing its features. "Can we?" she whispered. "Or are we just postponing the inevitable?" Neither noticed Annie in the shadows, watching with knowing eyes as she clutched a letter from Catherine Wells in her apron pocket, a letter that could change everything. The morning Sophia confirmed her pregnancy dawned grey and cold. Dr. Martinez's office was eerily quiet as she stared at the test results, her hand unconsciously protecting her abdomen. The doctor's words about health risks and necessary precautions faded into background noise as her mind raced with impossible calculations. "Your blood pressure concerns me," Dr. Martinez was saying. The stress you're under. It's not good for either of you. Have you considered telling the father?" Before Sophia could respond, her phone buzzed with Victor Blake's name on the screen. Her hands trembled as she declined the call, but seconds later a text appeared in my office. 2 p.m. Non-negotiable. The Santoro Enterprises building loomed before her that afternoon, its glass facade reflecting clouds that threatened rain. The security guard barely glanced at the visitor's pass Victor had arranged, though Sophia felt like an imposter as the executive elevator carried her to the 47th floor. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Victor's office, she could see Mark in his conference room across the way, passionately presenting something to the board. He looked energized, alive in a way she'd never seen him before in this setting. "Quite a transformation you've inspired," Victor observed, following her gaze. The mighty Mark Santoro, champion of social causes, his voice dripped with sarcasm as he turned to face her. "Tell me, does he know yet? About the baby?" Sophia's sharp intake of breath confirmed his suspicions. Victor smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes as he placed a thick folder on his desk. "Do you know what's in here? Evidence. Evidence that you approached Mark that night deliberately. That you researched him, planned the encounter. That you've been working with corporate raiders to destabilize Santoro Enterprises." "That's ridiculous," Sophia protested, but Victor held up his hand. "Truth is irrelevant. Perception is everything. One leak to the right journalists and Mark's enemies will have exactly what they need. The board will demand his resignation. The foundation will be dismantled. Everything he's trying to build will crumble." Sophia watched Mark through the window, her vision blurring with unshed tears. "Why are you doing this?" "Because sentiment is dangerous in our world. Mark is threatening billions in potential profits with his new direction. His father built this company on ruthless efficiency, not community gardens and reading programs." Victor's voice softened with false sympathy. "You say you love him? Prove it. Disappear. Let him return to who he's meant to be." He slid an envelope across the desk. Inside were plane tickets, bank account details, and new identification documents. A clean start. For you and the child. Generous monthly payments. The best medical care. Excellent schools. All we require is your absence." "And if I refuse?" Victor's smile vanished. "Then I release the evidence. Mark's reputation is destroyed. The company collapses. Thousands lose their jobs. And that child you're carrying, born into scandal, forever marked by it. Is that the life you want for your baby?" Through the window, Sophia watched as Mark's presentation ended. Board members were shaking his hand, smiling. He looked happy, purposeful. She thought of the garden at PS 721, of Lucy and the other children who had come to depend on the foundation's support. "How long?" she whispered. "You leave tonight. No goodbyes, no explanations. A clean break is kinder in the end." Victor checked his watch. "I've arranged a car. It's waiting downstairs." As Sophia stood to leave, her legs unsteady, Victor added, "Oh, and Miss Matthews. Catherine Wells sends her regards. She made the same choice once, you know, for the greater good." The words hit Sophia like a physical blow. She stumbled slightly, steadying herself against the door frame as the full weight of Victor's manipulation became clear. Not just her future, but her past, her very identity. He controlled it all. Through her tears, she watched Mark gathering his presentation materials, unaware that his world was about to shatter. "I'm sorry," she whispered, though he couldn't hear her. "I'm so sorry." The apartment felt smaller than usual as Sophia packed her life into a single suitcase. Her hands moved mechanically, selecting essentials while her mind replayed Victor's threats. Each cherished item she left behind felt like another piece of her heart breaking the children's artwork. Photos from the garden, small gifts from Mark that had made this modest space feel like home. Through her window, she could see Annie's bookstore across the street, its warm lights a beacon she'd no longer follow. The elderly woman had been more than a neighbor, she'd been the mother figure Sophia had always craved. Now she would join Catherine Wells in the ranks of lost mothers. Her phone buzzed continuously, messages from Mark, each one more concerned than the last. Meeting ran late. Can I come by? Are you okay? You're not answering, Sophia, please. Something feels wrong. She read each one through tears, unable to respond, knowing one word from her would shatter her resolve. Dr. Martinez had warned about stress affecting the pregnancy, but what choice did she have? The folder Victor had shown her contained more than just fabricated evidence. There were photos of Catherine Wells holding a baby, her as a baby, hospital records, adoption papers. Her entire identity was a carefully constructed lie, and Victor held all the threads. A knock at the door made her freeze. Sophia Annie's voice carried through the thin wood. I saw your light on. I made soup. The kindness in those words nearly broke her. Sophia pressed her hand against the door, letting the tears fall silently until Annie's footsteps retreated. Her resignation letter to PS 721 was brief, citing family emergency. The thought of her students, of Lucy's gap-toothed smile, of the garden they'd cultivated together brought fresh waves of pain. The Foundation's programs would continue without her, she told herself. Mark would ensure that, at least until Victor steered him back to his old path. The last item she packed was the sonogram image from her recent appointment. Twins. The universe had a cruel sense of irony, giving Mark not just one child but two, then forcing her to deny him the knowledge of their existence. She tucked the image into her jacket pocket, close to her heart. A text from Victor confirmed the arrangements. Car waiting at the back entrance. Driver has your new documents. Remember our agreement? Complete silence. Complete separation. Another message followed. Consider this a kindness. I'm giving your children a chance at a life unmarked by scandal. Sophia's hand rested on her still flat stomach. I'll protect you, she whispered to her unborn children. Whatever it takes, the words echoed those Catherine Wells must have spoken years ago, making the same impossible choice. The night was appropriately stormy as she made her way downstairs, echoing that first fateful night with Mark. The black car idling in the alley seemed to absorb the darkness around it. The driver, stone-faced and silent, held an envelope containing her new identity, Caroline Matthews, a fresh start built on more lies. As the car pulled away, Sophia allowed herself one last look at her world. Annie's bookstore, where so many dreams had been shared, the school barely visible in the distance, where she'd found her purpose. And high above, the lights of Santoro Enterprises pierced the night sky, where Mark would soon discover her absence. The phone buzzed one final time. Mark again. I love you, the message read simply. Whatever's wrong, we can face it together. Sophia turned off the phone, dropped it into her bag, and felt the last bridge to her old life burn. The twins stirred within her, too small yet to make their presence known to anyone but her. I'm giving you your father's gift, she whispered. A chance at an untarnished future, even if it means he can never know you exist. The car merged into Manhattan traffic, carrying her toward a future she'd never wanted, leaving behind a love she'd never planned. The price of protection, it seemed, was measured in broken hearts. Mark stood in Sophia's empty apartment, the silence deafening. The space still held her essence, a half-empty cup of tea on the counter, student papers neatly stacked on the table, the lingering scent of her perfume. But the important things were gone: her clothes, personal documents, the small photo album she always kept beside her bed. She left this, Annie said softly, holding out an envelope. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her usual cheerful demeanor replaced by a profound sadness. The letter inside contained only a few lines. Sometimes the greatest act of love is to leave. Please don't look for me. Forgive me. The words blurred as Mark read them repeatedly, searching for hidden meanings, for any clue to explain the inexplicable. His phone calls went straight to voicemail, emails bounced back undelivered. It was as if Sophia had vanished into thin air, leaving only questions and a void that seemed to consume everything. At PS721, the children's confusion was heartbreaking. Lucy approached Mark during his visit to the garden, her small face serious. "Did Miss Matthews leave because of the bad men with cameras?" she asked, referring to the paparazzi that had haunted the school. "She promised to help me plant sunflowers." The Foundation's board meeting that afternoon was tense. Victor Blake presented a compelling case for scaling back community initiatives, citing Sophia's departure as evidence of the program's instability. "Perhaps it's time to return to our core business objectives," he suggested smoothly. Mark barely heard the discussion. His mind kept returning to their last conversation in Annie's bookstore, searching for signs he should have seen. Had she been trying to tell him something? Had he been too caught up in his plans, his vision of their future, to notice her struggles? The press was merciless. "Gold digger flees Santoro's social experiment fails," read one headline. "Mystery teacher disappears with Foundation secrets," claimed another. Mark's PR team worked overtime to contain the damage, but the narrative was already forming another society scandal, another failed romance. Late that night in his penthouse office, Mark reviewed security footage from the day Sophia disappeared. He watched her enter the building, saw her meeting with Victor. Something about her posture as she left his office caught Mark's attention, defeated, yet determined. Like someone carrying a heavy burden. She received a visitor that morning, Richard Blake reported, having conducted his own quiet investigation. A doctor's office called Martinez, and there were calls from a blocked number in the days leading up to her departure. Mark's instincts, honed by years of business dealings, screamed that there was more to the story. Sophia wasn't someone who ran from challenges. She faced them head-on with grace and determination. Whatever had driven her away had to be significant enough to override her natural resilience. The garden at PS721 began to wither without Sophia's care. The children tried to maintain it, but something vital was missing, the spirit that had made it more than just plants and soil. Mark found himself there often, among the failing vegetables and wilting flowers, feeling a parallel to his own life. "She loved you," Annie said one evening, finding him staring at Sophia's empty apartment windows. "Whatever made her leave, remember that. Love doesn't always look the way we expect it to." But love wasn't supposed to leave without explanation. It wasn't supposed to create a void that seemed to grow larger with each passing day. As Mark watched the sunset paint the city gold, he made a decision. He would find her, not to bring her back if she truly wanted to be gone, but to understand. He owed their love at least that much. 3 months after Sophia's disappearance, Mark Santoro's transformation took a darker turn. His penthouse office, once a testament to corporate success, now resembled a detective's war room. Maps marked possible locations, surveillance photos covered walls, and empty whiskey bottles littered his desk. The morning board meetings, which he now frequently missed, painted a stark picture. Santoro Enterprises' stock had dropped 15%. The Foundation's initiatives were stalling. Even Richard Blake's typically unwavering loyalty showed signs of strain as he presented the latest financial reports. "Mark, you need to pull yourself together," Richard urged, closing the office door on another round of shareholder complaints. "The Preston merger is falling apart. Our major investors are threatening to withdraw." His words fell on deaf ears as Mark studied a grainy security camera image from a bus station in Boston, another false lead. The drinking had started gradually, a glass of scotch to help him sleep, then 2, then the whole bottle. The cleaning staff whispered about finding him asleep at his desk, surrounded by printouts of hospital records and travel manifests. His once immaculate appearance deteriorated. Designer suits gave way to wrinkled shirts and days of stubble. Victor Blake watched this decline with calculated interest, occasionally dropping subtle hints about Sophia's past that sent Mark down new rabbit holes of investigation. Each lead proved more frustrating than the last, each dead end pushing him further into obsession. At PS721, the situation was equally grim. The foundation's programs began to falter without proper oversight. The community garden, once a symbol of hope, withered under autumn's early frost. Lucy and her classmates still asked about Miss Matthews, their innocent questions like knives to Mark's heart. One particularly dark evening, Annie found him sitting in Sophia's empty apartment, which he'd continued to pay rent on, refusing to let it go. The space remained exactly as she'd left it, becoming a shrine to absence. "You're not the only one suffering," Annie said softly, settling into a worn armchair. "But destroying yourself won't bring her back." Mark looked up, his eyes bloodshot. "I keep thinking about our last conversation, about choices and consequences. What if she was trying to tell me something? What if I missed the signs?" His voice cracked on the last word, the whiskey making his thoughts blur together. The investigation was taking its toll on his health. His doctor had warned about elevated blood pressure, insomnia, the dangerous combination of alcohol and stress, but Mark couldn't stop. Each morning brought new theories, new possibilities, new paths to explore. His mother's attempts at intervention only made things worse. Eleanor Santoro arrived unannounced one morning, armed with introductions to suitable young women from their social circle. "Enough of this, Mark," she demanded. "You're throwing away everything your father built over some schoolteacher who clearly used you." The argument that followed was explosive. Mark's defense of Sophia, fueled by whiskey and desperation, ended with him ordering his mother out of his office. The scene played out in front of stunned employees, becoming yet another piece of gossip for the corporate grapevine. Rebecca, his loyal assistant, tried to maintain some semblance of normalcy. She screened his calls, rescheduled meetings, and made excuses to the board. But even her dedication had limits, Mr. Santoro. She finally said one evening, "You've built something remarkable here. Don't let it all fall apart over this." But that was precisely what was happening. The empire Mark had spent his life building was crumbling around him, and he couldn't bring himself to care. Every success felt hollow, every achievement meaningless without Sophia to share it with. Late one night, as storm clouds gathered over Manhattan, Mark made a discovery that changed everything. Buried in financial records was a series of payments from a Santoro Enterprises subsidiary to a private medical clinic. The same clinic whose business card he'd found in Sophia's apartment. The revelation sobered him instantly. This wasn't just about a woman running from a relationship. There were deeper currents at play, secrets that someone, perhaps Victor, had gone to great lengths to protect. For the first time in months, Mark felt his mind clearing. He poured the remaining whiskey down the drain, straightened his tie, and began to plan. Someone had orchestrated Sophia's disappearance, and he would find out who, no matter the cost. In a small apartment on the outskirts of Seattle, Caroline Matthews, formerly Sophia, struggled through another sleepless night. Her pregnancy had progressed significantly, the twins making their presence known with increasingly active movements. The doctor had ordered bed rest due to complications, but rest proved elusive as she watched rain streak down her windows, so similar to that fateful night in New York. Her new life was a careful construction of half-truths. The local school where she'd secured a teaching position believed she was a widow, a story that explained both her solitude and her occasional tears. Her neighbors, kind but distant, saw only a quiet mother to be preparing for her children's arrival. The morning sickness had been brutal, complicated by stress and loneliness. Dr. Wilson, her new obstetrician, had expressed concern about her blood pressure and weight loss. "You need a support system," she'd advised during the last checkup. "Family, friends, someone to help you through this." But Sophia's support system was 3,000 miles away, in Annie's warm bookstore, in Lucy's gap-toothed smiles, in Mark's strong embrace. The thought of Mark sent a fresh wave of pain through her. She'd seen the news reports about his decline, each headline a dagger to her heart. Victor's weekly updates, delivered with cruel precision, detailed the unraveling of both Mark and his company. Her hands rested on her swollen belly as one of the twins kicked particularly hard. Your father would love you so much, she whispered into the darkness. He would move mountains to protect you. The irony that she'd taken that choice from him in the name of protection wasn't lost on her. The small apartment held few personal touches. Victor's instructions had been clear about maintaining minimal connections, but she'd allowed herself one indulgence: a small garden on her tiny balcony. The plants were struggling in the Seattle weather, much like their caretaker, but they provided a tenuous link to her former life. Financial stability wasn't an issue. Victor's monthly deposits arrived like clockwork, blood money that made her feel ill even as she used it for prenatal vitamins and baby supplies. 2 cribs stood partially assembled in the corner, a project she couldn't face completing alone. The isolation was the hardest part. She'd catch herself turning to share a thought with Mark, only to face empty air. Sometimes she'd dream of the garden at PS 721, of teaching moments with her students, only to wake to the sound of unfamiliar traffic and foreign sirens. Her due date was approaching, and with it mounting fears. How would she manage twins alone? How could she look into their eyes every day and see Mark's features reflected back at her? The weight of her decisions pressed down, threatening to crush her. One particularly difficult evening, after a concerning doctor's appointment, Sophia found herself researching Mark online. The photos shocked her: his gaunt face, the lost look in his eyes, the evident toll of alcohol and sleepless nights. The latest article detailed the Foundation's struggling programs, including the closure of several community initiatives. The guilt was overwhelming. She'd meant to protect him, to preserve his legacy, but instead she seemed to have destroyed everything he valued. The carefully constructed rationalization for her departure began to crack. In a moment of weakness, she dialed Annie's bookstore number, needing to hear a familiar voice. She hung up at the first ring, but the attempt triggered an alert on her phone, a reminder of Victor's surveillance. Within minutes, her phone buzzed with his message: "Remember our agreement. One call home, and everything we discuss becomes public." That night, as Seattle's rain echoed New York's storms, Sophia made a decision. She began writing letters, one for each twin, to be opened when they were older. They deserved to know about their father, about the sacrifice that had torn their family apart before it could truly begin. "Your father," she wrote, tears smudging the ink, "is the kind of man who sees value in growing gardens in concrete jungles, who believes in second chances and the power of transformation, who taught me that love isn't about grand gestures, but about daily choices and quiet courage." The letters became her therapy, a way to preserve the truth, even if she could never share it. Each word was a testament to a love that had bloomed like their garden, unexpected, resilient, and ultimately sacrificed to forces beyond their control. The crisis at Santoro Enterprises reached its breaking point on a cold December morning. The boardroom, normally a bastion of corporate power, had become a battlefield. Victor Blake stood at the head of the table, presenting damning financial reports that showed the company's steepest decline in its 30-year history. Gentleman Victor addressed the assembled board members, his voice carrying practiced concern. "The numbers speak for themselves. The Foundation's expenses have drained our resources. The Preston merger is dead. Our stock has dropped 23% in 3 months. He paused, letting the implications sink in, and our CEO appears increasingly unstable. As if on cue, Mark burst into the meeting, late and disheveled. The contrast between his current state and his former polished appearance shocked even his strongest supporters on the board. His eyes were bloodshot, his expensive suit wrinkled, and the scent of scotch lingered despite the early hour. "You're discussing my company without me." Mark's voice carried an edge that made several board members shift uncomfortably. He grabbed the financial reports, scanning them with growing agitation. "These numbers are manipulated. Someone's deliberately sabotaging our community initiatives." Richard Blake attempted to intervene, placing a steadying hand on his friend's shoulder. "Mark, please. Let's discuss this privately," but Mark shrugged him off, advancing toward Victor with barely contained fury. Mark's accusation cut through the room's tension. You've been working against me from the start. The foundation, Sophia, all of it, his hands trembled as he spread documents across the table: bank statements, clinic payments, surveillance reports. Victor maintained his composed facade. Mr. Santoro appears to be having another episode. Perhaps we should call security. Several board members nodded in agreement, their faces showing a mixture of pity and embarrassment. The situation deteriorated rapidly. Mark's accusations became more frantic, mixing personal grievances with corporate conspiracies. When security arrived, the scene became even more chaotic. The board watched in stunned silence as their CEO, the man who had built an empire through ruthless precision, was escorted from his own meeting. In his office afterward, Richard found Mark staring out the window, an untouched glass of water replacing his usual scotch. "The board is calling for an emergency vote," Richard informed him quietly. "They want to suspend you temporarily, citing health concerns." Mark's laugh held no humor. "Health concerns? They're worried I'm getting too close to the truth." He turned to face his oldest friend. "Did you know, Richard, about Victor's involvement in Sophia's disappearance? About the clinic payments?" Richard's hesitation spoke volumes. "Mark, you need help. This obsession, it's destroying everything you've built, everything your father built." The mention of his father sparked something in Mark's eyes. "My father built this company on the belief that power brings responsibility. Not just to shareholders, but to people. Somewhere along the way, we forgot that." As word of the morning's events spread through the building, Rebecca worked frantically to contain the damage, but videos had already leaked, showing Mark's confrontation with the board. The press descended like vultures, their headlines growing more sensational by the hour. In the midst of this chaos, a small envelope arrived on Mark's desk. Inside was a single hospital admission form from the clinic he'd been investigating. The patient's name had been redacted, but the date matched Sophia's last week in New York. More significantly, it was marked prenatal care high risk. The revelation hit Mark like a physical blow. Sophia hadn't just left him, she'd left carrying his child. The pieces began falling into place: her sudden departure, Victor's involvement, the ongoing surveillance. Someone had used his unborn child as leverage. But that evening, as the board prepared for their emergency vote, Mark sat in his darkened office making preparations of his own. The company he'd sacrificed everything for now felt like a prison. But with the truth about Sophia's pregnancy confirmed, the stakes had changed dramatically. On his desk, beside the hospital form, sat a resignation letter. But Mark had no intention of signing it. Instead, he began composing a different document, one that would expose Victor's manipulation and reshape Santoro Enterprises from the ground up. The time for drinking and self-pity was over. He had a family to fight for. The Seattle winter turned particularly harsh as Sophia entered her final month of pregnancy. Complications had forced her into hospital bed rest, her blood pressure dangerously high. The sterile hospital room became her world, its white walls closing in with each passing day. Dr. Wilson delivered the news during morning rounds: one of the twins is showing signs of distress. The umbilical cord, she hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "We may need to consider an emergency C-section." The medical bills mounted despite Victor's payments. Specialist consultations, additional monitoring, and extended hospital stays quickly depleted her resources. When she called the number Victor had provided for emergencies, his response was cold. The agreement covered standard medical care, not complications. Alone in her hospital room, Sophia faced the darkest night of her life. The monitors beeped steadily, tracking 3 heartbeats, hers and her unborn children's. One of those heartbeats was becoming increasingly irregular. The thought of losing either baby, of failing to protect them before they even entered the world, was unbearable. In that moment of desperation, she reached for her phone. Mark's number was still memorized, though she deleted it months ago. One call could change everything. He had the resources to ensure the best medical care to save their children. Her finger hovered over the keypad. But Victor's surveillance was thorough. Within moments of turning on her phone, a text arrived. Remember the consequences. Think of Mark's reputation, his company, his legacy. One call destroys everything. The night nurse found Sophia crying silently, one hand protectively covering her swollen abdomen, the other clutching a worn photograph of the PS721 garden. "Honey," the nurse said gently, "you need someone here with you. Family, friends, anyone?" "There's no one," Sophia whispered, the words catching in her throat. The truth was far more painful. There were people who would come running if they knew, who would move heaven and earth to help her. But their very love made them dangerous to contact. The doctors discussed options in hushed tones outside her door. Words like fetal distress and critical decisions filtered through. Without proper intervention, she could lose one or both babies. The choice she'd made to protect them now threatened their very survival. In the early hours of the morning, staring at the ceiling as monitors tracked her baby's heartbeats, Sophia reached a breaking point. She'd believed she was protecting her children by keeping them from scandal, by giving them a chance at an untarnished life. Instead, her sacrifice might cost them everything. A nurse brought her breakfast hospital food she couldn't stomach. "The social worker will visit today," she mentioned kindly. "There are programs that can help single mothers in difficult situations." But Sophia wasn't a single mother by circumstance. She was alone by choice, a choice that seemed increasingly impossible to justify as her children's lives hung in the balance. The weight of her decisions, the consequences of her silence, pressed down on her with suffocating force. The specialist's office felt unnaturally quiet as Dr. Wilson delivered the critical update. "The smaller twins' condition has deteriorated significantly. Without immediate intervention, we risk losing both children. We need to perform an emergency cesarean section, but the procedure carries substantial risks given your condition." Sophia listened as the doctor outlined the complexities the specialized surgical team required, the intensive care needs, the astronomical costs that far exceeded standard insurance coverage. Each detail hammered home the impossible situation she faced. "There's a specialist at Mount Sinai in New York," Dr. Wilson continued, her voice gentle but urgent. "He's pioneered a procedure specifically for cases like yours, but the transfer alone would cost." She named a figure that made Sophia's heart sink. In her hospital room afterward, Sophia faced the most devastating choice of her life. The local hospital could perform a standard procedure, but the risks were significant. The specialist in New York offered better odds, but reaching out to him meant breaking her silence, risking everything she'd sacrificed to protect. The social worker arrived with forms for emergency medical assistance, but the processing time would take weeks they didn't have. "There are other options," she suggested carefully. "Private charities, emergency funds." But Sophia knew the truth. There was only one person who could arrange immediate transfer to New York's best specialists. One person who had both the resources and the right to know. The same person she'd been hiding from for months. Her hands shook as she reached for her phone. Victor's number appeared immediately, as if mocking her desperation. His response to her plea was predictably cold. The agreement was clear. Any contact with New York voids everything. Think carefully about your next move. The monitor tracking the smaller twins' heartbeats stuttered again, each irregular blip a reminder of the precious time slipping away. Sophia thought of the letters she'd written to her children, explaining why she'd chosen to keep them from their father. How hollow those explanations seemed now, weighed against their very survival. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Annie, the elderly nurse who'd been caring for her, entered with fresh water. She'd taken a special interest in Sophia, perhaps sensing the deeper story behind her patient's solitude. "Sometimes," Annie said quietly, "arranging the water pitcher, protecting people means knowing when to let them help you. Pride and fear make poor guardians for those we love." The words struck deep, cutting through months of rationalization. Sophia had convinced herself that disappearing was an act of love, that denying Mark his children somehow protected them all. But sitting in that hospital room, listening to her baby's struggling heartbeats, the true selfishness of her choice became clear. Another alarm sounded, the smaller twins' heart rate dropping dangerously low. Dr. Wilson rushed in, her face grave. "We're running out of time. I need your decision now." Sophia closed her eyes, tears streaming down her face. The choice before her was no choice at all. She could maintain her silence and risk losing her children, or she could break her promise to Victor and give them a chance to live. With trembling fingers, she reached for her phone one last time. Not to call Victor, but to dial a number she'd tried so hard to forget. As the phone rang, she whispered a prayer, not for forgiveness, but for understanding. Mark's phone rang at precisely 3:47 a.m., the screen displaying an unfamiliar Seattle area code. He answered immediately, having learned during his months of searching that vital information could come from unexpected sources at unusual hours. Mark, Sophia's voice, weak but unmistakable, broke 6 months of silence. "I'm so sorry, but I need," her words dissolved into quiet sobs. Sophia. Mark was instantly alert, his heart racing. "Where are you? What's wrong?" In the background, he could hear the steady beep of hospital monitors. Dr. Wilson took the phone, explaining the situation with professional efficiency. His twins, were in distress, one particularly critical. Without specialized intervention, the prognosis was grave. She named the New York specialist who could help, outlined the urgency of the situation. Mark's world simultaneously shattered and reformed. Twins, his children. Sophia's disappearance, her sudden departure, everything shifted into sharp, devastating focus. He moved with the decisive efficiency that had once defined his corporate leadership. "I'm arranging the medical transfer now," he informed Dr. Wilson, already sending messages to his private aviation team. "The specialist will be waiting when you arrive. Tell Sophia," he paused, emotions threatening to overwhelm his carefully maintained control. "Tell her to hold on. I'm coming." Within minutes, Richard arrived at his office, summoned by an urgent call. The brothers stood in silence as Mark explained the situation. Victor knew, Mark concluded, his voice tight with controlled fury. He orchestrated all of this. "Not alone," Richard admitted, looking years older in that moment. "I knew about the pregnancy. I've been helping her, sending money through untraceable accounts. But Victor threatened to expose everything, not just about Sophia, but about Catherine Wells, about the company's hidden accounts. I thought I was protecting everyone by staying quiet." Mark's response was interrupted by Victor's unexpected arrival. The lawyer stood in the doorway, his usual smooth confidence showing signs of strain. "I see congratulations are in order," he said dryly. "Though I warned MS. Matthews about the consequences of breaking our agreement." But agreement. Mark advanced toward him, years of pain and rage evident in every step. "You blackmailed the mother of my children into disappearing. You used my unborn babies as leverage." Victor's mask finally cracked. "I protected your empire. A scandal-free succession for the next generation. Everything I did was for the future of Santoro Enterprises. My children might die because of your protection." Mark's voice was deadly quiet. "The company you claim to be protecting is in shambles. The Foundation's work, real help for real people, destroyed. And for what? Power? Control." The confrontation was interrupted by Richard's phone buzzing. The medical transport was ready. Mark turned to leave, but Victor moved to block his path. "The board won't survive this scandal. Your father's legacy." "My father's true legacy," Mark cut him off, "was teaching me that power without compassion is worthless. Richard, call security. Have them escort Mr. Blake to the federal investigators who are very interested in certain offshore accounts." As Victor was led away, still protesting, Mark grabbed his coat. Richard touched his arm, stopping him briefly. "The company can wait," Mark finished. "I have more important matters to attend to. My family needs me." The Mount Sinai Hospital's private wing buzzed with controlled urgency as the medical transport arrived from Seattle. Mark stood at the entrance, his heart pounding as the gurney carrying Sophia was wheeled past. Her face was pale, her hands protectively cradling her swollen abdomen, but her eyes found his immediately. Catherine Wells appeared beside him, her presence unexpected but somehow fitting for this moment of revelation. "I should have told you both long ago," she said quietly, watching as the medical team transferred Sophia to pre-op. "The truth about who she is, about why Victor had such power over us." The specialists' team worked efficiently, preparing for the emergency procedure. Through the observation window, Mark watched as monitors were attached, vital signs checked, medical histories quickly reviewed. Each beep of the fetal monitors reminded him of how close he'd come to losing everything without ever knowing it existed. "Sophia is my daughter," Catherine's words cut through the hospital's background noise. 28 years ago, Victor Blake orchestrated her adoption, used it as leverage to control both our lives. When she met you, when she began changing your perspective on the company's role in society, he saw his control slipping. Mark absorbed this information, pieces of the puzzle finally clicking into place. The mysterious payments, the clinic connections, Sophia's reluctance to discuss her past, it all formed a pattern that had been invisible until this moment. "She has your eyes," he said softly, remembering all the times he'd looked into those eyes, never seeing the legacy they carried. Did she know? About you? Victor told her the day she discovered she was pregnant. Catherine's voice cracked. He used it as the final piece of leverage, threatened to expose not just her connection to me, but decades of corporate manipulation that would have destroyed both our families' reputations. Through the window, they watched as the medical team prepared Sophia for surgery. The specialist approached them, his expression serious but confident. "We need to move quickly," he explained. "The smaller twin is showing signs of distress, but we've dealt with more challenging cases successfully." As Sophia was wheeled toward the operating room, she reached out, catching Mark's hand. "I thought I was protecting them," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Protecting you, your legacy, everything you'd built." "The only legacy that matters is in there with you," Mark replied, squeezing her hand before the medical team had to separate them. "Everything else is just details we can sort out together." Catherine stepped forward as the doors closed behind Sophia. "There's more you need to know," she said, removing a thick folder from her designer bag. "About Victor, about the company, about why he was so desperate to maintain control. I've spent months gathering evidence, preparing for this moment." Mark glanced at the operating room doors, then back at Catherine. The truth was finally unfolding, but right now, only one thing mattered: the 3 lives hanging in the balance behind those doors. Catherine opened the folder in the private hospital waiting room, spreading decades of carefully preserved documents across the table. As Mark reviewed each page, the true scope of Victor Blake's manipulation became clear. "Victor didn't just orchestrate Sophia's adoption," Catherine explained, her voice steady despite the weight of her revelations. "He systematically created a network of compromised executives throughout Santoro Enterprises. Each promotion, each strategic appointment, all designed to maintain his control over the company's direction." The documents revealed a complex web of offshore accounts, masked as charitable foundations but actually serving as repositories for funds skimmed from corporate acquisitions. Mark recognized several of the account numbers from his own investigation into Sophia's disappearance. "The Preston merger wasn't failing naturally," Catherine continued, highlighting specific transactions. "Victor deliberately sabotaged it when he realized it would bring too much regulatory scrutiny. The foundation's struggles, the board's resistance to your community initiatives, all orchestrated to maintain the status quo he'd built." Richard arrived as they were reviewing the evidence, his own collection of documents adding to the mounting evidence. "I started tracking Victor's activities months ago," he admitted, placing a USB drive on the table. "After I learned about Sophia's pregnancy, I knew I had to protect both of you, but I didn't understand the full scope until now." The picture that emerged was devastating in its complexity. Victor had spent decades positioning himself as the indispensable problem solver while actually creating the very problems he claimed to resolve. The Foundation's struggles, the recent corporate crisis, even Mark's public spiral all carefully managed to serve Victor's ends. But why, Mark asked, looking up from a particularly damning series of emails, why go to such lengths to control everything? Because your father knew, Catherine answered quietly. Before he died, he discovered some of Victor's early manipulations. Instead of exposing him immediately, he began implementing safeguards, including a provision in his will that would transfer controlling interest in the company to charitable trusts if certain conditions were met. Richard nodded, adding, when you started the Foundation, when you began shifting the company's focus toward community impact, you were unknowingly triggering those conditions. Victor wasn't just protecting his position, he was preventing the automatic transfer of corporate control. A nurse interrupted their discussion with an update from the operating room. The procedure was progressing well, but complications remained possible. Mark felt the weight of 20 years of corporate deception measured against the precious lives being fought for behind those surgical doors. There's one more thing, Catherine said softly, removing a final document from her bag. Your father left this letter for you, to be delivered when the truth about Victor emerged. I've carried it for years, waiting for this moment. Mark held the sealed envelope, his father's familiar handwriting stark against the aged paper. Inside lay not just the final pieces of the puzzle, but perhaps his father's true vision for Santoro Enterprises' legacy. Mark's hands trembled slightly as he opened his father's letter, the hospital waiting room falling silent. The familiar handwriting brought an unexpected wave of emotion as he began to read. My son, if you're reading this, then you finally discovered what I long suspected about Victor Blake's influence over our company. More importantly, you've begun to understand what I always hoped Santoro Enterprises could become, not just a successful business, but a force for positive change in our community. The true measure of a company isn't in its stock price or market share, but in its impact on people's lives. I built this company from nothing, not to create an empire, but to make a difference. Somewhere along the way, I lost sight of that mission, allowing people like Victor to twist our purpose into something purely focused on profit. Your recent choices, the Foundation, the community initiatives, the willingness to challenge the status quo have shown me that you understand what I never properly articulated. Success without purpose is hollow. Power without responsibility is dangerous. Mark paused, glancing toward the operating room doors where his future was being determined. The letter continued. The provisions I put in place weren't just about protecting the company from Victor's manipulation. They were about ensuring that Santoro Enterprises would eventually return to its original mission of serving the community. Your instincts in starting the Foundation were right. It's the future I always envisioned but lacked the courage to implement. The trauma center where you're likely reading this letter. I built it 30 years ago, not because it was profitable, but because our community needed it. The fact that it's now saving your own family is a reminder that our actions have consequences far beyond what we can imagine. Catherine and Richard waited quietly as Mark finished reading, understanding the significance of this moment. The letter concluded with a personal note that brought tears to Mark's eyes. I'm proud of the man you've become, son. Not for the wealth you've accumulated or the business success you've achieved, but for your willingness to question everything in pursuit of what's right. Your mother will say I'm being sentimental, but some truths need to be spoken. The company's future is in your hands now. Trust your instincts. The changes you've been fighting for? They're exactly what Santoro Enterprises was always meant to be. Don't let anyone, not Victor, not the board, not even the ghost of my reputation, tell you otherwise. Love, Dad. As Mark folded the letter, the specialist emerged from the operating room, his surgical mask still in place. The next few moments would determine everything: his family's future, his father's legacy, the true purpose of everything they'd built. Mark stood, supported by Catherine and Richard, ready to face whatever news awaited. His father's words echoed in his mind, providing clarity he'd been seeking for months. Whatever happened next, he finally understood the true meaning of legacy. The specialist news brought overwhelming relief. Both twins had survived the emergency procedure. Though the smaller one would need time in the NICU, their prognosis was positive. The next few hours found Mark seated beside Sophia's recovery room bed, her hand clasped in his, both processing the emotional weight of their reunion. "They're beautiful," Mark whispered, having just returned from his first visit to the NICU. "The boy has your nose and the girl his voice caught. She already has that determined look you get when facing a challenge." Sophia stirred, still groggy from the anesthesia. "I wanted to tell you so many times," she managed, her voice weak but urgent. "Every day, every moment. The lies felt like they were suffocating me." Mark gently brushed her hair from her face, noting how pale and fragile she looked against the hospital sheets. "I understand now," he assured her. "Catherine explained everything. About Victor's manipulation, about her connection to you, about my father's true vision for the company." The morning light filtered through the hospital windows as Catherine entered the room, hesitating at the threshold. The moment between mother and daughter was weighted with decades of unspoken truths. "I should have been stronger," Catherine began, moving closer to Sophia's bed. "Should have fought harder to keep you, to protect you from Victor's influence." Sophia's grip on Mark's hand tightened. "You did what you thought was right," she replied, her voice thick with emotion. "Just like I thought I was protecting our children by leaving." She looked at Mark. "We all made choices based on fear and manipulation." Richard arrived with news from the company. Victor had been taken into custody. Federal investigators were combing through the evidence Catherine had provided, and the board was in emergency sessions discussing the future of Santoro Enterprises. "The Foundation's programs?" Mark asked, his priority clear despite the corporate chaos. "Safe," Richard assured him. "In fact, several board members have expressed interest in expanding them, especially after learning about your father's original vision for the company." As they talked, a nurse brought the stronger twin in for her first proper meeting with her parents. The tiny bundle, wrapped in a pink blanket, represented everything they had almost lost to fear and secrecy. "Clara," Sophia whispered, tears streaming down her face as she held her daughter for the first time with Mark beside her. "After your grandmother," she looked at Catherine, who covered her mouth to stifle a sob. "And the boy?" Mark asked softly, his finger caught in his son's strong grip during the NICU visit. "Liam," Sophia suggested. "It means strong-willed protect to something he's already proven to be, fighting so hard to survive." As the morning progressed, the room filled with a sense of healing. Not just physical recovery, but the emotional mending of relationships torn apart by years of secrets and fear. They had a long way to go, but the path forward was finally clear. The weeks following the twins' birth brought gradual healing, both physical and emotional. Sophia remained in the hospital while Liam gained strength in the NICU, with Mark dividing his time between his family's bedside and carefully restructuring Santoro Enterprises' leadership. During quiet afternoon hours, Mark and Sophia began the delicate process of rebuilding their relationship. Each day brought new revelations as they shared the painful details of their time apart. Mark described his descent into despair, his obsessive search, and his eventual understanding of Victor's manipulation. Sophia spoke of her isolation, her fear, and the constant struggle between protecting their children and denying them their father. "I read about your decline in the papers," Sophia admitted one evening, Clara sleeping peacefully in her arms. Each headline felt like a knife. "Victor would send me updates, using your suffering as proof that his way was right, that silence was the only option." Mark gently took Clara, placing her in the hospital bassinet. "I kept your apartment exactly as you left it," he confessed. "Visited the garden every day, hoping to understand why you'd gone. The children at PS 721 still ask about you." The mention of her former students brought fresh tears. "Lucy's reading program?" she asked hesitantly. The community garden. Annie kept everything going, Mark assured her. She never lost faith that you'd return. She's been asking permission to visit, actually. The whole community has rallied around your story. Catherine's daily visits added another layer to their healing process. She brought photographs from Sophia's early childhood, sharing memories of the brief time they had together before Victor's intervention. These moments helped mother and daughter forge a new relationship, one based on truth rather than secrets. Richard contributed to the reconciliation in his own way, providing detailed documentation of how he had secretly supported Sophia during her absence. His quiet resistance to his brother's schemes, though late in coming, helped bridge the gap between the corporate world that had driven them apart and the family they were struggling to become. The turning point came when Mark brought the board's proposal for restructuring the company. Instead of presenting it as a finished document, he asked for Sophia's input, acknowledging her insight into community needs and social impact. "I want to build something new," he explained, spreading the papers across her hospital table. "Not just a company with a charitable foundation, but an organization that truly integrates social responsibility into its core. Something worthy of our children's inheritance." Sophia studied the proposals, her professional experience as an educator offering valuable perspective on community initiatives. For the first time, their different worlds began to merge rather than collide. "Trust isn't rebuilt in grand gestures," Sophia observed, watching Mark with Clara while discussing future plans. "It's in these small moments, these daily choices to be honest, to be vulnerable, to include each other in decisions." As Liam grew stronger in the NICU, so did their foundation of trust. Each challenged medical decisions, corporate restructuring, family boundaries became an opportunity to demonstrate their commitment to transparency and shared decision-making. The day Sophia returned to PS 721, the entire community gathered to welcome her home. Annie had transformed the bookstore's front window into a nursery-themed display, complete with congratulatory messages and children's artwork. The school's community garden, though touched by winter frost, bore signs of careful maintenance during her absence. Lucy was the first to spot her former teacher, her excited shout drawing others from nearby shops and apartments. "Miss Matthews, you're back!" The young girl rushed forward, then stopped short at the sight of the twin strollers Mark was carefully maneuvering through the gathered crowd. "These are Clara and Liam," Sophia introduced, her voice steady despite the emotion of the moment. The community's response to her return, not with judgment, but with unconditional support, overwhelmed her carefully maintained composure. Annie emerged from her bookstore, carrying a worn copy of The Secret Garden that had always been Sophia's favorite. "We kept your story time spot ready," she said softly, embracing her young friend. "Some stories just need the right time to be told." The revelation of Victor's manipulation and Catherine's connection to Sophia had made headlines, but the community's response focused on healing rather than scandal. Local business owners who had once viewed Santoro Enterprises with suspicion now engaged actively with the Foundation's expanded programs. Mark watched as Sophia reconnected with her students, explaining her absence in terms they could understand. "Sometimes grown-ups make mistakes when they're scared," she told them, holding Clara while Liam slept peacefully in his stroller. "But real friendship means being there when someone finds their way back home." The community garden became a symbol of their reconciliation. Together, Mark and Sophia worked with the students to prepare the soil for spring planting. Each seed represented a new beginning, each tender shoot a testament to patience and care. Catherine joined these gatherings, finding her own place in the community that had sheltered her daughter. Her corporate expertise, combined with her newfound commitment to transparency, helped bridge the gap between business interests and community needs. The bookstore's back room, where Mark and Sophia had once confronted the seeming impossibility of bridging their worlds, became a meeting space for the Foundation's new initiatives. Local residents offered insights that no corporate consultant could match, their practical wisdom shaping programs that truly served community needs. "This is what my father meant," Mark observed one evening, watching Clara and Liam amid the bustling community gathering. Success isn't measured in dollars or stock prices. It's in moments like these, in lives touched and communities strengthened. Sophia, surrounded by the family and community she'd nearly lost to fear, understood completely. The path to healing wasn't in grand gestures or public declarations, but in daily acts of trust, in choosing connection over isolation, in building bridges instead of walls. 1 year after the twins' dramatic arrival, the Santoro family gathered in Annie's bookstore to celebrate multiple new beginnings. The historic building, now expanded to include a community center and educational space, had been transformed into an elegant venue for the evening's events. Mark stood at the podium, addressing the assembled crowd of community members, corporate executives, and family. Today marks not just my children's first birthday. He began, his voice carrying the quiet confidence of a man who had found his true purpose, but also the official launch of the restructured Santoro enterprises. The company's transformation had been comprehensive. Under the new charter, developed with input from both community leaders and business experts, profit margins were no longer the sole measure of success. Social impact metrics carried equal weight in corporate decisions, fundamentally changing how the organization operated. Sophia, holding Clara while Catherine entertained Liam, watched her husband with pride. The past year had brought changes none of them could have imagined. The Foundation's programs had expanded beyond New York, creating a model for corporate social responsibility that other companies were beginning to emulate. Richard, now serving as Chief Community Impact Officer, presented the first annual Social Impact Report. The numbers told a compelling story: educational programs reaching thousands of children, community development initiatives revitalizing neglected neighborhoods, and sustainable business practices setting new industry standards. But the real measure of our success. Mark continued, gesturing to the gathered community members, isn't in these reports. It's in the stories of lives changed, communities strengthened, and barriers broken down. It's in watching my children grow up in a world where business and social responsibility aren't opposing forces, but essential partners. The formal announcement that followed had been carefully planned. Santoro Enterprises would transition to a hybrid structure, with significant ownership shares transferred to a community trust. The move, inspired by Mark's father's original vision, ensured that the company's commitment to social impact would outlast any individual leadership. As evening fell, the celebration shifted from corporate announcement to family gathering. Clara and Liam, now walking with the determined wobble of 1-year-olds, became the center of attention. Their existence, once a carefully guarded secret, now symbolized the possibility of bridging seemingly impossible divides. Annie, watching from behind her beloved counter, smiled at the scene before her. The bookstore that had once been a refuge for a scared, pregnant Sophia had become the heart of a transformed community, proof that sometimes the best stories are those that seem least likely. 2 years after the transformation of Santoro Enterprises, Catherine Wells stood in her office at the Foundation's new headquarters, surveying the city skyline. The changes in the corporate landscape were visible even from this height: community gardens dotting formerly empty lots, renovated buildings housing educational programs, and the distinct sense of renewal that had spread through once neglected neighborhoods. The door opened as Sophia entered with the twins, now active toddlers whose energy filled every room they encountered. Clara immediately gravitated toward the wall of family photos, pointing to faces she recognized, while Liam explored the space with the careful determination that had marked his earliest days in the NICU. The board approved the expansion of the education initiative Sophia announced, her role as executive director of community programs allowing her to blend her teaching background with corporate strategy. We'll be implementing the model in 5 more cities by year's end. Catherine watched her grandchildren with wonder, still amazed by the chance to be part of their lives. The legacy she had once feared would be defined by secrets and shame had been transformed into something remarkable. The Wells Santoro Educational Trust, established in her name, had become a leading force in educational equity. Mark joined them, having just concluded a meeting with international partners interested in replicating their community-focused business model. The family gathering in Catherine's office wasn't just personal, it represented the successful integration of family bonds and professional purpose that had once seemed impossible. Victor's sentencing was finalized today, Mark mentioned quietly, sharing the news that marked the final chapter of their past struggles. The former lawyer's schemes had been fully exposed, leading to significant reforms in corporate governance across the industry. Richard's testimony had been instrumental in ensuring justice while protecting the company's new direction. Catherine moved to her desk, retrieving a document she'd been saving for this moment. "I've been thinking about legacy," she began, "not just in terms of business or wealth, but in terms of values and purpose." The papers she placed before them detailed the establishment of a new fellowship program designed to support young parents pursuing education and career advancement. This, she explained, watching Clara attempt to teach Liam a new word is how we truly honor your father's vision, Mark, not just by changing how business is done, but by ensuring that no one has to choose between family and purpose, between success and social responsibility. 5 years later, Annie's bookstore had evolved into something far beyond its original scope, yet maintained its essential character as a community cornerstone. The expanded space, now known as Stories Memories, included a thriving education center, community meeting rooms, and a garden cafe that served as a gathering place for local residents. On a warm spring morning, Mark and Sophia watched their twins participate in the store's weekly reading circle. Clara, channeling her mother's teaching spirit, helped younger children sound out difficult words, while Liam constructed elaborate stories about the garden's latest blooms. Their youngest, Sarah, born 2 years after the transformation of Santoro Enterprises, played contentedly in Catherine's lap. The morning's gathering held special significance, the official announcement of Annie's retirement and the transfer of the bookstore's ownership to a community trust, ensuring its continued role as a neighborhood hub. The elderly bookseller, who had been instrumental in bringing Mark and Sophia back together, beamed with pride as she surveyed what her modest shop had become. Sometimes Annie addressed the gathered crowd, "The best stories are the ones that write themselves. They start with a chance meeting, face seemingly impossible obstacles, and end with something greater than anyone could have imagined." She gestured to the walls adorned with photographs documenting the community's journey from the early days of the garden project to the latest graduation ceremony for the Foundation's education program. Richard, now married to a local teacher he'd met through the Foundation's programs, shared news of the latest expansion, a nationwide network of community-centered business initiatives, all modeled on the successful integration of corporate resources and local needs that had begun in their neighborhood. Mark stood to make the final announcement, but found himself momentarily overwhelmed by the sight before him, his family whole and thriving, their community stronger than ever, and his father's vision not just realized but exceeded in ways no one could have predicted. "Our story," he began, drawing Clara and Liam close, "proves that the greatest legacy isn't built in boardrooms or measured in profit margins. It's created in moments of courage, sustained by acts of love, and enriched by the bonds of community." Sophia joined him, carrying Sarah, as Catherine looked on with tears of joy. The bookstore's bell chimed as new visitors entered, its familiar sound a reminder that every ending was just another beginning, and the best stories were those shared by hearts bound together by love, trust, and the courage to begin again. What did you think about this emotional story of love, sacrifice, and redemption? We'd love to hear your perspective on Sophia's difficult choice. Was she right to leave Mark to protect their children and his legacy, or should she have trusted in their love to overcome any obstacles? Share your thoughts in the comments below about what you would have done in her situation. Your voice matters in our growing community of storytellers and story lovers. If you enjoyed this tale of family, forgiveness, and second chances, remember to subscribe and turn on notifications to join us for more touching stories that remind us of the power of love and human connection. We carefully craft each narrative to touch hearts and inspire hope. Help us spread these messages of hope and redemption. If this story moved you, consider sharing it with friends and family who might need a reminder that it's never too late for second chances and that true love can overcome any obstacle. Together we can create a ripple effect of empathy and understanding in our community. Every share brings us closer to touching another heart with stories that matter.